I still remember the exact tone of his voice that day, the way it sliced through me with such cold precision that it didn't even feel real at first. It was supposed to be one of the happiest weeks of my life, the countdown to a wedding we had planned for over a year, the ceremony that had occupied every one of my waking thoughts, every conversation with family, every dream I had painted in my mind since he slipped that ring onto my finger. Yet instead of vows and promises, what I received was a sentence that shattered everything in its path. He didn't stumble over the words, or show even a flicker of hesitation. He delivered them like a man reading from a prepared script, flat and unfeeling. Don't wait for me. I found someone worth more. That was it. No apology, no regret, not even the courtesy of shame. It was as if all those months of planning, all those nights where we whispered about our future, all the sacrifices I had quietly made to support him and his ambitions, were meaningless, just a disposable phase that he could discard the moment he thought he had a better offer. I remember sitting there, staring at him, trying to piece together whether I had misheard or misunderstood, because the human brain isn't wired to accept betrayal so abruptly. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I was a statue carved in disbelief. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, but he didn't fill it with explanations. He just shrugged, almost impatient, as if I should have known all along that this was coming, as if my role in his story was merely temporary. That shrug hurt more than the words. It was the dismissal of everything I thought we were. He told me not to make a scene, not to embarrass myself by clinging, because, in his words, it's better to cut clean now than waste any more time. Waste. That was the word he used, as though the years I had given him were trash to be taken out before the new furniture arrived. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand answers, to remind him of the late nights when I stayed awake helping him study for his exams, of the mornings when I woke up early to make sure he had breakfast before his big meetings, of the money I had quietly pulled from my own savings to help him pay off debts he didn't want anyone to know about. But instead, my body betrayed me. I just sat there frozen, my heart racing so violently I could feel it in my throat, my hands trembling as I dug my nails into my palms to keep from falling apart. I told myself not to cry, not to give him the satisfaction of seeing me broken. When he stood to leave, he didn't even look back. That absence of a glance was the final nail. It confirmed what the words had already made clear. To him, I was already a chapter closed, a name scratched out, a dress that would never be worn. He walked away, as if he hadn't just burned down the life we were about to build, as if he hadn't just gutted the very foundation of trust and loyalty I had foolishly believed we shared. The room was silent after he left, but inside me there was a cacophony of thoughts, each one fighting to make sense of the wreckage. How long had he been planning this? Was the ring on my finger just a placeholder until he secured something he thought was better? Was I simply a safe bet? Someone to occupy his time until someone with more status, more money, more glitter walked into his life? I wanted to believe it was impulsive, that he had been seduced suddenly, but deep down, I knew betrayal like this doesn't happen overnight. It grows in the shadows, fed by lies, concealed by half-smiles and rehearsed excuses. And yet, as brutal as it was, part of me recognized something even sharper underneath the pain: clarity. Because in that moment, staring at the empty space where he had been sitting, I understood that the man I had loved wasn't real. He was a projection, a version of himself he had carefully curated for me to fall in love with. The real man, the one capable of discarding me with such indifference, had been there all along, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. And I had been blind, willfully blind, mistaking ambition for passion, charm for character, promises for truth. That night, I lay awake in bed, still wearing the engagement ring, though now it felt like a shackle. My phone buzzed constantly, friends asking about wedding details, family confirming travel plans, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. How could I tell them that the man I was supposed to marry had decided I was no longer good enough, that he had chosen someone else a week before standing beside me at the altar? I imagined their faces, the pity in their eyes, and I refused to let them see me as a victim. I turned off my phone, clutched the pillow to my chest, and silently promised myself that this would not be the story of my ruin. The pain was real, deep, and consuming, but even in those early hours, before I could fully process the betrayal, A seed was planted inside me, a seed of defiance, because while he had chosen to throw me away like something replaceable, I knew something he didn't. I was not a woman who stayed discarded. He thought his words would bury me, but they were only going to ignite something far stronger than the version of me he thought he knew. And though I didn't yet know how, I understood one truth with icy clarity. I would rise from this, and when I did, he would regret the day he ever thought I was someone he could walk away from. That was the night I stopped being the bride-to-be. That was the night I became something else entirely. A woman whose story was no longer defined by him, but by what I would do next. The morning after his departure felt like waking up inside a house that had been hollowed out by fire, walls still standing, but everything inside reduced to ash. I moved through my own apartment as if I were trespassing in someone else's life, every corner echoing with ghosts of moments we had shared, every object a reminder of the years that had now been pronounced wasted. The coffee mugs on the counter where we used to drink together on lazy Sundays, the books on the shelves he had insisted we buy as a future library for our kids, the framed photographs capturing smiles that suddenly looked artificial. All of it mocked me with the cruel realization that the life I thought I was living had been nothing more than scaffolding built around a lie. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the engagement ring still on my finger, and the weight of it pressed down on me like a chain, not because of the carat or the gold, but because it was no longer a symbol of love. It was now evidence of my gullibility. My mind replayed the years we had spent together, every sacrifice cataloged in detail, every moment of loyalty now turned into a ledger of wasted investment. I remembered the night I stayed up with him before his big exam, whispering encouragement into his ear, even as my own deadlines piled up. I remembered skipping vacations to funnel money into his dreams, choosing his ambitions over my rest, because I believed we were building something together. I remembered holding him when he cried over rejections, assuring him that success was around the corner, never doubting that we were a team, never imagining that my unwavering faith would one day be repaid with betrayal. How do you calculate the worth of such years? How do you put a number on trust, on time, on love, given without hesitation? Sitting there in silence, I felt the crushing realization that I had poured myself into a vessel that had always been leaking, a man who took my devotion as entitlement, not as a gift. The sense of waste was unbearable, not only because of what I had lost, but because of what I had postponed. I had put my own dreams on hold to make space for his. I had said no to opportunities that required me to move away or take risks because I believed in the solidity of us. I had let friendships fade, convinced that my loyalty should revolve around the future we were creating. And now, with a single sentence, he had told me all of it meant nothing. The hours spent planning our wedding, the painstaking care with which I chose flowers and dresses, the long conversations about how our first home would look, every detail was now just wasted breath, wasted ink on a script that would never be performed. Yet beneath the grief, something sharper began to stir. The more I cataloged what I had given, the more I felt anger rise like a tide, washing away the initial numbness. He wanted me to believe I was discarded, but I realized he had underestimated me. He had taken my sacrifices as weakness, when in reality they had made me strong. A weaker woman might have crumbled completely under the weight of betrayal, but I felt something shift inside me, a spine hardening, a resolve forming from the ruins. If the years behind me were wasted on him, then I refused to let the years ahead be wasted on grief. Still, the nights were the hardest. Lying in the dark, I would hear the echo of his voice telling me not to wait for him, and it would unravel everything again. The silence of my phone, the absence of his name lighting up my screen, was both agony and clarity. Friends reached out, puzzled by my sudden withdrawal from wedding planning, but I couldn't bring myself to explain, not yet. It wasn't shame that kept me quiet. It was the desire to transform this humiliation into something else before anyone else could define me by it. I wanted to control the narrative of my life, to make sure that when the truth came out, it wouldn't be a story of pity, but one of strength. As I stared at the ceiling night after night, the weight of the wasted years pressed on me like a burden strapped across my chest. But with each breath I began to see it differently. Those years had been my education. I had learned patience, resilience, the art of giving without expecting immediate return. I had learned how deeply I could love, And even though that love had been squandered on the wrong person, it was proof that I had something powerful within me. He might have discarded me for someone he deemed worth more, but in truth, it was he who had devalued himself, choosing superficial gain over genuine loyalty. That realization began to twist the pain into something sharper, something useful. There were moments when I wanted to crumble under the bitterness of it, to cry out that I had wasted too much, that I would never get those years back. But then I would catch my reflection in the mirror, swollen-eyed but unbroken, and remind myself that waste only exists if nothing grows from it. What if those years, painful as they now seemed, were not wasted but invested in the woman I was about to become? What if every sacrifice, every tear, every patient word I had given him was now fuel for my transformation? The thought both terrified and exhilarated me. The weight of the years had nearly crushed me, but it also anchored me in a way. I was no longer drifting in blind love or empty promises. I was standing in the ashes, heavy with experience, yes, but also ready to rise with a strength I had never known I possessed. And though the wound was fresh and bleeding, somewhere inside me a voice whispered that the story was far from over. He thought he had closed the book, but he had only turned a page. The chapters to come would not belong to him. They would belong to me. It did not take long before the vague shadow of the woman he had abandoned me for began to take shape. Betrayal has a way of leaking through cracks no matter how carefully it is concealed. And even though he had not offered me the courtesy of a name, the world is small when you have mutual circles, shared acquaintances, and a wedding that had already drawn attention. Whispers reached me first. Half-finished sentences from people who did not know I was listening. Small hesitations in conversations when they realized I had not yet been told. Soon, the puzzle pieces slid into place, and her image emerged clear enough to sear itself into my mind. She was not just some random stranger, not some unexpected fling born of drunken impulse. She was someone positioned precisely where temptation and ambition intersected. Someone who could be leveraged for what she represented rather than who she was. That was the first wound layered on top of the original betrayal, realizing that his better option was not even about love, but about calculation. Her name was Melissa, though among her peers she was often called by her surname, because it carried a certain weight. She was the daughter of a man with influence, wealth, and connections, the kind of man who could open doors to exclusive rooms where reputations are made and futures are secured. She worked in the same industry as he did, orbiting just close enough to his world to make herself visible, but never close enough to be in danger of being overlooked. She was the sort of woman who was always impeccably dressed, who seemed to treat every encounter as a networking opportunity, who smiled with her lips but never with her eyes. I had seen her once or twice before, at events where he insisted I wear a certain dress or carry myself a certain way, and now I realized why. Even then, she had been circling. The realization cut deeper than the initial abandonment, because it meant the betrayal was not sudden at all. It had been cultivated, grown quietly in the background of our life together. The dinners he claimed to have with colleagues, the late nights at the office, the excuses that at the time I had brushed off because trust was the cornerstone of our bond. They all crystallized now into a clear pattern. Melissa was not just a passing temptation. She was the alternative he had been weighing against me long before he delivered his cruel verdict. And when the scales finally tipped, it was not because of love or passion, but because she offered him something he believed I could not. Access, status, the glittering illusion of a life elevated beyond the ordinary. I studied her from afar, through fragments of social media, and the casual mentions others dropped in conversation. She was the kind of woman who curated her existence into perfection. Every photo a calculated display of sophistication, every caption dripping with the subtle arrogance of someone who believed themselves above the rest. In another life, I might have dismissed her as shallow, a person whose worth was built on appearances. But now, through the lens of betrayal, she became the embodiment of everything he had traded me for. She was the mirror reflecting back to me the truth I did not want to face. To him, my loyalty, my sacrifices, my love were all invisible next to the shimmer of her father's money and the spotlight she carried with her. The anger that stirred in me was complicated. Part of it was directed at her, of course, for stepping into a space she must have known was already occupied. She had seen me on his arm. She had watched us together, and yet she had leaned into him anyway. But the deeper, harsher anger was reserved for him, because she was not the one who had promised me forever. She had not been the one to kneel with a ring, to whisper about growing old together, to map out dreams on the fragile parchment of our future. No, that had been him, and the fact that he could discard those promises so easily for the shallow thrill of being associated with her world told me everything I needed to know about his true nature. In the quiet hours of the night, when sleep refused to come, I would replay her image in my mind, not as a rival, but as a symbol. She was not better than me. She was simply different, tailored to the void in him that no amount of love could fill. He wanted validation, shortcuts, the illusion of power, and she was the convenient vessel through which he believed he could achieve it. And in that realization, a strange calm settled over me, because if he had chosen her over me, then it was not I who had lost something of value. It was he who had revealed himself as a man so hollow that he could not recognize what real worth looked like. Still, the knowledge of her existence burned like salt in an open wound. Every time I thought I had reached the bottom of my pain, another layer peeled back to reveal more betrayal. He had not just left me. He had replaced me. He had not just canceled our wedding. He had already moved on to constructing the next performance, one in which she would play the bride, and I would be erased. That was the cruelty of it. Not only the loss of him, but the deliberate substitution of my role with someone he thought shone brighter. But as the days passed and I learned more about her, something inside me shifted. I stopped seeing her as competition and began to see her as a symptom. She was not the disease that destroyed us. She was only the manifestation of his weakness. And once I understood that, I began to reclaim my power. If she was his better option, then what he had truly revealed was that he measured worth not by love or loyalty, but by utility. And that meant I had never stood a chance. Not because I was not enough, but because he was incapable of valuing what I offered. That clarity became fuel. Instead of sinking into despair, I began to imagine what it would feel like to stand before him one day, not broken and begging, but whole and radiant, while he realized what he had thrown away. Melissa's profile, carefully built on social pretense, no longer intimidated me. It simply reminded me of the game he had chosen to play. And if he thought he had left me defeated on the sidelines, he would one day learn that I was not a discarded pawn, but a player in my own right, ready to write a story where I would not just survive his betrayal, but rise beyond it. The days that followed were suffocating at first, a blur of hours bleeding into each other as I tried to process the enormity of what had happened. Betrayal is not a single blow. It is a wound that reopens each time a memory resurfaces, each time a song plays, each time a notification buzzes on a phone that no longer lights up with the name you once longed to see. I wandered through my life as though carrying an invisible weight strapped across my shoulders, the kind that forces you to hunch without realizing it, the kind that makes you smaller than you once were. Yet even in the midst of that heaviness, I began to feel something else stirring beneath the surface, an undercurrent that was sharper than grief and colder than sadness. It was anger, but not the wild and flailing kind that leads to screaming or tears. It was an anger with edges, precise and deliberate, an anger that whispered rather than shouted, promising that I would not remain on the floor where he had left me. The choice revealed itself not in some grand epiphany, but in a series of quiet moments. Standing in front of the mirror one morning, I saw my own reflection, pale, hollow-eyed, fragile. For a second, I almost did not recognize the woman staring back at me, and that frightened me more than anything. Was this who I was destined to become? A ghost of myself, defined forever by the man who decided I was replaceable? No. The answer came before I even finished asking the question. I would not let him have that power. If he had chosen to define me as disposable, then my only task was to rewrite that narrative so completely that he would choke on the memory of it. I thought back to the way he had spoken to me when he left, the casual cruelty of, "Don't wait for me," and the smug superiority of, "I found someone worth more." Those words could have been chains if I let them, binding me to the belief that I was lesser. But the more I repeated them in my head, the more they began to transform, not into shackles, but into fuel. If he had deemed me unworthy, then it was not because I lacked value, but because he lacked the eyes to see it. And if he could not see me, then perhaps it was time I started seeing myself more clearly than ever before. The decision not to be a victim was not about pretending the pain did not exist. It was about choosing what to do with it. I could lie in bed and let grief erode me, or I could stand and sharpen it into something unbreakable. I chose the latter. The tears still came, but I did not see them as weakness. I saw them as cleansing, washing away the version of myself that had been tethered to his validation. Every time I wiped my face dry, I whispered to myself that I was not broken, only reshaping. Slowly, I began to take stock of my life, not through the lens of what I had lost, but through the possibilities that still remained. My career, which I had often placed second to his ambitions, suddenly became a lifeline. I poured myself into my work with a kind of focus I had not felt in years, staying late not because I needed distraction, but because I realized how much I had held myself back in order to fit into the mold of his dreams. The more I worked, the more I rediscovered a competence and brilliance in myself that he had once praised but had subtly undermined, making me believe I needed him to shine. In reclaiming my independence, I began to see the outlines of a future that did not require him at all. I also reconnected with people I had neglected. Friends who had grown distant because I was always busy with his plans or his needs welcomed me back with open arms. Conversations over coffee, laughter spilling late into the night, reminders that I was more than someone's fiancé. They all helped to stitch me back together. My family, too, became a quiet strength, their support a steady hum beneath the noise of my healing. Each interaction was a reminder that my identity was not singularly defined by his abandonment. I was still me, and me was enough. But perhaps the most profound shift came internally. For the first time in years, I began to ask myself what I wanted, not what we wanted. What did I dream of? Where did I want to go? What did I want to achieve? It was startling how foreign those questions felt. How quickly I realized that I had subsumed my own desires beneath the weight of building a life around him. And now, with that weight gone, there was both fear and freedom in realizing that I could build for myself. That clarity sharpened into resolve. If he thought I would crumble, he was mistaken. If he believed I would beg for scraps of his affection, he had underestimated me. I would not chase him. I would not try to win him back. I would not fight for a place in a life he had already decided to erase me from. My revenge, if it could even be called that, would not be loud or petty. It would be silent, deliberate, undeniable. I would rise. I would become someone whose existence was so undeniably radiant that he would have no choice but to see the magnitude of what he had lost. And so, I made the decision. I would not be the victim in his story. I would be the author of my own. From that moment forward, every step I took, every decision I made, would not be guided by the wound he left, but by the strength I was reclaiming. I did not know then exactly how the path would unfold, or what form my transformation would take, but I knew this. He would come to regret the day he thought I was someone he could discard, because while he had chosen a better option, I had chosen myself. And there is no option better than that. Reinvention did not begin with fireworks or dramatic gestures. It began with small, deliberate steps, each one almost invisible to the outside world, but monumental within me. The morning after I made the decision not to remain a victim, I sat at my desk with a notebook open and stared at the blank page. I had spent so much time writing lists of wedding details, planning floral arrangements, color schemes, seating charts, pages filled with fantasies that no longer mattered. Now, staring at the emptiness of that paper, I realized it was the first time in years I had a page that belonged only to me. No expectations, no compromises, no roles to perform. Just space waiting to be filled with my own design. And so I began to plan. Not a wedding, not a shared future, but a reconstruction of myself. The first layer of my plan was internal. I knew that no external success would matter if I remained fragile inside, so I started with discipline. Each morning, I forced myself out of bed before the heaviness of sadness could anchor me down. I exercised, not to punish myself, but to feel my body grow stronger, to remind myself that I was alive, capable, and resilient. I changed my eating habits, choosing nourishment over comfort, because I wanted energy, not escape. At night, instead of scrolling through the digital remnants of his betrayal, I read. biographies of women who had rebuilt themselves after devastation, novels that carried me into worlds where strength and independence were rewarded. Slowly, my mind began to sharpen again, no longer dulled by the constant replay of his voice. The second layer was professional. For years, I had bent my schedule and ambitions around his, declining opportunities that would have required travel, ignoring promotions that might have intimidated him. Now I reached out to the connections I had neglected, revisited the offers I had once turned down, and put myself forward for new projects. I stayed late at work, not because I needed distraction, but because I rediscovered how intoxicating it was to create something on my own terms. My bosses noticed. My colleagues began to respect me in new ways, and soon doors that had seemed sealed before began to crack open. The version of me that had once been hidden behind his shadow was emerging, and she was formidable. The third layer was social. I had spent so long tailoring my friendships around what was convenient for us as a couple, often letting them fade because he preferred to keep his world separate. Now, I reached back into those connections. I called old friends, met them for dinner, shared laughter that felt rusty at first, but soon poured out of me freely. I surrounded myself with people who valued me not because of who I was with, but because of who I was. These gatherings stitched me back together, reminding me that my worth was not tied to being someone's fiancé, but to being myself. And then, there was the final, most delicate layer: appearance. It was not about vanity, not about becoming prettier to prove him wrong. It was about reclaiming the woman I saw in the mirror. I cut my hair shorter, sharper, as if to sever the past with each strand that fell. I invested in clothes that reflected who I was now, not who I had been when I was trying to fit into his image of a future wife. Colors I had avoided because he said they didn't suit me began to reappear in my wardrobe, bold and unapologetic. When I looked at myself, I no longer saw the abandoned bride. I saw a woman sculpting herself anew. This plan of reconstruction was not just about survival. It was about transformation. It was not enough for me to heal. I wanted to thrive, to rise so far above the ashes that when he eventually saw me again, he would not recognize the woman standing before him. I imagined that day often, not as a moment of revenge, but as a moment of revelation, when he would realize that in discarding me, he had created something far greater than anything he could ever have held onto. But beneath that vision, there was something deeper. The plan was never truly about him. Yes, the thought of his shock fueled me on difficult days, but the more I built, the more I understood that this was about me reclaiming what had always been mine: my voice, my choices, my life. For too long I had measured myself by what I gave to him, by how useful I was to his story. Now, I was writing my own, and the plot no longer bent around his orbit. I set goals for myself and ticked them off one by one. A certification course I had postponed for years, I signed up and passed it with distinction. A charity I had always wanted to support but never had time for. I volunteered, and in doing so, I met people whose resilience and generosity humbled me, fueling my own growth. Travel, something I had shelved because it didn't fit our budget or timeline, became a priority. I booked a solo trip, terrified and exhilarated, and returned feeling more alive than I had in years. Each step was a brick laid in the foundation of the new life I was constructing, steady and deliberate, a fortress against any future storm. The more I invested in myself, the clearer it became that his betrayal had been the catalyst, not the conclusion. He thought he had ended me by choosing someone worth more, but in truth, he had freed me from the cage I had built around myself in devotion to him. The irony was sharp. In losing him, I had gained everything I had ever suppressed. And while he played house with his glittering, better option, I was becoming someone he would never be able to reach again. Someone too high, too strong, too whole. The plan of reconstruction was not written in stone but in action, and every day I lived it. I felt the woman I had been fading, replaced by someone fiercer, someone who no longer waited for validation. And though he did not yet know it, every brick I laid, every step I took, was bringing me closer to the day when he would return, not triumphant, but desperate. And when that moment came, I would be ready, not with tears or pleading, but with the quiet, devastating power of a woman who had rebuilt herself into something untouchable. At first, the changes I made to my life were quiet, like whispers in the dark that only I could hear, but soon they began to take shape in ways that no one could ignore, least of all him. It wasn't deliberate that the world around us would start noticing, but the truth is that transformation cannot remain hidden forever. When a woman begins to rise from the ashes, the glow she carries touches every room she walks into, every conversation she holds, every step she takes. I saw it reflected back at me in the way strangers looked twice, in the way colleagues paused before complimenting me, in the sudden attention from people who had once dismissed me as merely someone's fiancé. I did not chase recognition, but it found me all the same, and slowly, word by word, it made its way back to him. I heard it first from a mutual acquaintance, someone who slipped into conversation a detail he must have meant casually, though it pierced me with a strange thrill. He said that he had run into my ex at an event, and apparently he had asked about me, not with genuine concern, but with that calculating curiosity that never truly left him. "She's been different lately, hasn't she?" he had said. "Seems like she's thriving." When I heard that, something inside me shifted. The woman he had left behind had been invisible to him, her sacrifices and devotion unseen. But the woman he had abandoned was no longer the one people were talking about. They were talking about me now, the reconstructed, redefined version, and I realized that even without seeking it, I was becoming a presence too large for him to ignore. The first signs of change reached him in subtle ways. He saw the photographs, no doubt, images from gatherings with friends where my laughter no longer looked forced, pictures from professional milestones where I stood confident, poised, and self-assured. Social media has a way of weaving its own narrative, and while I had not curated it to provoke him, I knew the story it told. It showed a woman who was not mourning her lost wedding, but living a life that seemed richer without him. It showed me glowing in places where he was absent, building connections that had nothing to do with his influence, and celebrating achievements that outshone his empty promises. And I knew that, for a man like him, seeing me thrive without him was the first thread tugging at the tapestry of his ego. At the same time, I began to hear cracks forming in his own story. Friends who had once spoken of him with admiration now whispered about tensions between him and his so-called better option. What had looked perfect on the surface, the glamorous outings, the carefully staged photographs, the sudden elevation of his social standing, was beginning to fray at the edges. The woman he had chosen, the one who was supposedly worth more, was showing her true nature, and it was nothing like the dream he had traded me for. They argued in public, according to one account, her voice sharp with disdain, while his face turned red with embarrassment. She wanted more from him than he could give, more money, more status, more ambition. What had once seemed like a prize was beginning to reveal itself as a burden, and he was stumbling under the weight of it. I did not gloat when I heard these things. Instead, I felt a strange detachment. The pain he had caused me had already been alchemized into something else, and now I could watch from a distance without being consumed by bitterness. It was almost clinical, the way I observed his downfall taking root, like a scientist studying the inevitable consequences of a flawed experiment. He had built his new life on shallow foundations, and now the cracks were widening. Meanwhile, the foundation I was building for myself grew stronger every day. Still, there were moments when I wondered if part of me secretly longed for him to see what he had lost, if my transformation was in some way driven by the desire for his recognition. But whenever that thought surfaced, I dismissed it, because I knew the truth. His validation no longer mattered. The change within me was not for him, but for myself. And yet, I could not deny that the irony of it pleased me. He had thrown me away as if I were nothing, and now the world was showing him, piece by piece, that I was far more than he had ever allowed himself to believe. The first time I saw him again was unplanned, an accidental crossing at a cafe where I was meeting a friend. He walked in with her on his arm, but the moment his eyes landed on me, I saw it. The flicker, the hesitation, the quick flash of recognition that was tinged with something darker. Regret. He tried to mask it, of course, with his usual arrogance, but I knew him too well. His smile faltered, his posture stiffened, and for a moment, the air between us carried all the words he hadn't said when he left me. He had expected me to crumble, and now here I was, not only standing but shining in a way that made her presence beside him seem almost trivial. She noticed it too, I think. Her hand tightened on his arm, her eyes darting between us with suspicion. I did not say a word to him. Not then. I simply held his gaze for a heartbeat longer than necessary, then turned back to my friend as though he were nothing more than background noise. That silence, that refusal to acknowledge him, was louder than any confrontation could have been. It was then that I realized the true nature of the change. It was not about altering how he saw me. It was about altering how I saw myself. I was no longer a woman defined by what I had lost, but by what I was creating. And though I knew he would begin to circle back, drawn by the realization of his mistake, I also knew that when the moment came, I would not be the woman waiting with open arms. I would be the woman who had moved beyond him, whose life was so expansive that he would seem small within it. The first signs of change had begun as whispers, then ripples, and now they were waves crashing against the fragile shore of the life he had chosen. And as I walked out of that cafe with my head held high, I understood with absolute clarity, this was only the beginning. The story he thought he had ended was gathering momentum, and soon the tide would rise high enough to drown the illusion he had built. The stories reached me gradually, whispered through mutual acquaintances, half hidden in social media posts that revealed more than they intended, fragments of gossip that painted a fuller picture than anyone realized. At first, I listened without interest, determined to keep my distance from the mess he had chosen for himself, but curiosity is a stubborn shadow. I had no desire to involve myself in his downfall, but when word reached me that cracks were appearing in the facade of his so-called better option, I could not help but lean closer, if only to confirm what I had already suspected. Illusions, after all, can only hold for so long before reality forces its way in. What I learned was both unsurprising and bitterly satisfying. The woman he had chosen, who had appeared flawless on the surface with her polished smiles and impeccable connections, was not the dream he had imagined. Behind closed doors, she was demanding, restless, and insatiable. What he once praised as sophistication quickly revealed itself as arrogance. What he had mistaken for ambition showed itself as greed, and the charm that had dazzled him at the beginning grew sharp and cruel when directed his way. They quarreled often, sometimes publicly, and it did not take long for those who had celebrated their pairing to notice the tension seeping through the cracks. She criticized him openly, cutting down his career with biting remarks, mocking his financial shortcomings compared to her family's wealth. For every ounce of validation he thought he had gained by choosing her, he now found himself diminished, his pride chipped away piece by piece, until what remained was a hollow man scrambling to maintain the illusion. I remember one afternoon when a friend told me she had witnessed them at a gala, her voice hushed as though recounting a scandal. He had stood beside Melissa, his shoulders tense, his smile brittle, while she laughed with another man in a way that was too intimate, too familiar. The entire room, my friend said, could feel the shift, could see the humiliation etched into his posture. He had traded loyalty for status, and now he was learning what it meant to be disposable in a world where appearances mattered more than love. I could almost hear his voice echoing back to me, "Don't wait for me. I found someone worth more." And I wondered if, in that moment, as he watched Melissa lean into another man's charm, those words tasted like ash on his tongue. But the collapse was not only social, it was personal too. Friends who had once supported him began to distance themselves, tired of the constant drama, the endless cycle of breakups and reconciliations that became the hallmark of his new relationship. The glamorous glow that had once drawn attention now repelled it, as people realized the spectacle was hollow. Meanwhile, whispers reached me that his career was suffering as well. Melissa's father, the powerful man whose approval he had craved, had grown impatient with his lack of progress, his inability to rise to the expectations set for him. It turned out that climbing by association is a fragile strategy, one that falters when the ladder you cling to decides you are not worthy of its rungs. And so, the very reason he had abandoned me, the promise of elevation, was crumbling beneath his feet. There were nights when I lay awake, thinking of him, but not with longing. Instead, I thought of how ironic it was that he had believed himself clever, strategic, destined for more, only to end up shackled to a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a temporary accessory. He had not chosen love or stability. He had chosen a mirage, and now he was choking on the desert dust of its collapse. And though part of me might once have wished to intervene, to save him from himself, that part of me was gone. I had rebuilt too much, grown too strong, to ever consider stepping back into the ruins he had created. Still, fate has a cruel sense of timing. It was around this period, as his illusion collapsed, that I began to notice his presence more. Messages left unanswered appeared in my inbox, his number flashing on my phone late at night, though I never picked up. Mutual friends hinted that he asked about me often, curiosity bleeding into desperation. "She seems happier now, doesn't she?" he had asked one of them, and I wondered if he hated the way the words tasted, because they carried an acknowledgement that he had not broken me after all. If anything, his betrayal had forged me into something stronger, while his choices had reduced him to fragments. I saw him once more in passing, at a crowded gathering where neither of us expected the other. He looked older somehow, though only weeks had passed, his posture bent, his expression weary, as though the weight of his crumbling illusion had settled on his shoulders. When his eyes met mine, there was no triumph in them, no pride, only the hollow desperation of a man who realized too late what he had lost. Melissa was not by his side that evening, and I could only guess why, but the absence spoke louder than words. He hovered at the edge of the room for a long time, perhaps hoping I would approach him, perhaps waiting for an invitation that would never come. I offered him nothing. My silence was the final cut, sharper than any insult. The collapse of the illusion was inevitable, but watching it unfold, I understood something profound. It was not my role to celebrate his downfall, or to mock his misery. It was simply my role to stand where I was now, unbroken, renewed, and stronger, so that when the final pieces of his world fell apart, he would see clearly what his choices had cost him. The illusion had been dazzling for a moment, but illusions always fade, and when they do, what remains is truth. And the truth was this: he had abandoned something real for something hollow, and now he was the one left empty-handed. The collapse was not the end of his story, though. It was only the prelude to what would come next, because illusions, once shattered, leave desperation in their wake, and it was only a matter of time before he came crawling back, not out of love, but out of need. And when he did, I already knew what my answer would be. It happened sooner than I thought it would, though by then I had already anticipated it like one anticipates a storm gathering on the horizon. The collapse of his illusion had not been a single explosion, but a slow unraveling. Threads tugged loose until the fabric could no longer hold together. And once the threads were gone, once the glittering facade he had so proudly traded me for dissolved into public arguments, financial strain, and a gnawing emptiness, he did what I always knew he would. He came back. Not with the arrogance he carried when he first walked away, not with the smug certainty of a man who believed himself too clever, but with the hollow desperation of someone who realized that he had gambled and lost. The first sign was a message, simple, almost pitiful in its restraint. "Can we talk?" Those 3 words glared back at me from my phone screen, a ghostly echo of the man who had once declared so easily, "Don't wait for me." I stared at them for a long while, my fingers hovering above the keyboard, not with temptation but with deliberation. I did not answer. I let silence speak for me, and in that silence, I imagined his impatience growing, his need gnawing at him. Hours later, another message arrived, longer this time, filled with apologies and explanations that clung together without coherence. He spoke of mistakes, of misunderstandings, of how he had been blinded and pressured, how he hadn't known what he was doing. But even through the apology, I could read the truth. It wasn't remorse that drove him to me. It was fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of losing the stability he thought I had always offered him. Fear of standing in the rubble of his choices without someone to sweep it away for him. When I still did not reply, the calls began. Late at night, in the quiet hours where desperation is hardest to conceal, his name would flash across my screen again and again. I never answered. Sometimes I let the phone ring until it stopped, savoring the sound of his persistence dwindling into emptiness. Other times I turned it face down on the table, carrying on with my evening as though he were nothing more than static in the background. He had once told me not to wait for him, and now it was he who was waiting, suspended in a silence that must have echoed louder than words. The first time he showed up in person, I almost laughed at the irony. It was at the very cafe where, weeks earlier, I had seen him with her, her hand possessive on his arm, his smile brittle and performative. This time, he was alone. He looked thinner, his clothes rumpled in a way that betrayed nights of unrest, and there was no trace of the smugness that had accompanied his cruel announcement. He approached my table as though unsure if he had the right, his eyes darting nervously, his voice low when he spoke my name. "Can we sit? Just for a moment?" It was strange, seeing him reduced to this version of himself, stripped of the arrogance and bravado that had once seemed inseparable from him. For a flicker of a second, I almost felt pity, but the memory of his words, "I found someone worth more," flashed in my mind, and the pity died before it could take root. I did not invite him to sit. I simply looked at him with a calm that unnerved him more than anger ever could, and after a long pause, I returned to my coffee, as though he were nothing more than an interruption. But he did not give up. He followed me out as I left, words spilling from him like a broken dam. He spoke of regret, of realizing too late what he had lost, of how things with Melissa had not been what he expected. He tried to remind me of the years we had shared, the moments of laughter, the plans we had made. He begged for another chance, his voice cracking with a desperation that would have once shaken me. But as I listened, I felt nothing, not anger, not longing, not even satisfaction, only emptiness, like watching an actor recite lines from a play I no longer cared to see. He had chosen his role, and now he was living its consequences. I walked away that day without giving him an answer, and that silence became my shield. He reached out again and again in the days that followed, each attempt more frantic than the last. Flowers left at my door, emails filled with apologies, even a letter written in his handwriting. Desperate gestures from a man who had finally realized that his choices were irreversible. But no matter what he did, it was too late. The woman he had abandoned was gone, and the woman I had become had no use for him. The desperate return was not the victory he imagined it would be. It was not a reunion or a reconciliation, but a reckoning. He had walked away believing he could return whenever he pleased, that I would be waiting, as though my worth depended on his recognition. But when he came back, he found not the abandoned bride he had left behind, but a woman who had rebuilt herself into something stronger, brighter, untouchable. His return was not the beginning of a second chance. It was the final proof that I had won simply by moving forward. And though he did not yet know it, the day was coming when I would make that victory clear. He had begged, and I had remained silent. But soon, when the moment was right, I would speak. And when I did, my words would cut sharper than any blade, because they would be the truth he had spent so long trying to avoid, that I would never, under any circumstances, take him back. The moment arrived, not with a grand stage or a carefully orchestrated plan, but in the quiet inevitability of his persistence colliding with my resolve. He had been circling for days, desperate, almost frantic, as though each unanswered message, each ignored call, only deepened his obsession with forcing the past back into existence. I knew it was coming. The confrontation where his pleading would no longer be left to voicemail or scribbled words on folded paper, but carried directly into my presence. And when it did, I was ready, not because I had rehearsed lines or practiced expressions, but because the truth had crystallized in me so completely that it required no preparation. He showed up at my apartment on a gray evening, the kind where the air feels heavy with rain, and the city seems suspended in a restless stillness. His knock was frantic, uneven, like the pounding of a man who feared the door might never open. I let him wait long enough for the desperation to settle before finally answering. When I did, the sight of him almost startled me. He looked worn, hollow-eyed, his confidence stripped away like skin peeled raw. His suit was wrinkled, his hair unkempt, his posture bent, as though carrying the invisible weight of humiliation. This was not the man who once told me with a sneer that he had found someone worth more. This was someone else entirely. A shadow, a man unraveling. He started speaking the moment I opened the door, words tumbling out in a rush, each one layered with panic and regret. He told me how much he missed me, how foolish he had been, how blind. He said that things with Melissa had been a mistake, that she had used him, manipulated him, that her promises were nothing but smoke. He tried to remind me of our history, painting our years together with strokes of nostalgia, as if memory could be weaponized to erase betrayal. He called me his anchor, his safe place, the only person who had ever truly believed in him. And for every word he spoke, I felt the weight of silence pressing back from within me, because while he reached into the past with trembling hands, I was standing firmly in the present, a woman no longer bound to him. I let him speak until his voice cracked, until his rehearsed apologies dissolved into fragmented pleas. And then, when the silence finally demanded my reply, I gave it to him, not with raised tones or dramatic gestures, but with the steady calm of a truth sharpened into a blade. I looked at him, really looked at him, and said, "Did you really think I'd take you back?" The words landed heavier than any scream could have, and I saw them carve into him instantly. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes widened, the realization sinking in that I was not playing the role he had expected. He must have imagined that my coldness was temporary, that beneath it still lingered the same woman who once built her world around him, the woman who would break at the sight of his vulnerability. But that woman was gone, and the one who stood before him now had no interest in salvaging the wreckage he had brought. I told him, calmly, deliberately, that his betrayal had been a gift, that in leaving me, he had forced me to discover a version of myself that I might never have known otherwise. I explained that the years I thought were wasted had in fact been my training ground, teaching me the resilience to rise higher than he could ever reach. I let him hear that his absence had not destroyed me but liberated me, and that the life I was building now was one where his name carried no weight. Each word seemed to drain him further, his shoulders slumping as though my refusal was heavier than all the disappointments he had suffered since leaving. He tried, of course, to rally. He spoke of change, of wanting to make amends, of deserving another chance. He even reached for my hand, but I stepped back before his fingers could touch me, and that small movement shattered whatever fragments of hope he had clung to. The rejection was final, not because I screamed it, but because I delivered it with a calmness that left no space for doubt. I did not need to prove my strength to him. My existence, whole and unshaken, was proof enough. For a long moment, we stood in silence, the rain beginning to tap against the windows behind me, the world outside carrying on indifferent to the scene unraveling in my doorway. His face was pale, drained of the color that once carried arrogance, and I knew he was seeing it now, what I had become. Not a broken bride abandoned at the altar, but a woman who had risen into her own power, who no longer needed his validation, who would never again settle for less than she deserved. When he finally turned to leave, his steps heavy and uneven, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction in his defeat. What I felt was clarity, the closing of a chapter that had lingered too long. His face, white with the shock of rejection, was not a trophy but a reminder. I had chosen myself, and in doing so, I had severed the last tie to the man who once thought I was replaceable. The cold refusal was not just the end of his desperate return, it was the final act of liberation. He had come back expecting forgiveness, expecting to reclaim what he had squandered. Instead, he walked away with the truth carved into him, that the woman he abandoned was gone, and the woman I had become was untouchable. In the days that followed his desperate visit and my cold refusal, the silence that lingered around me was unlike any silence I had known before. It was not heavy with grief, as it had been in the beginning, nor was it punctuated by the echoes of betrayal. It was a silence that breathed, a silence that stretched wide and clear, like the horizon after a storm when the air smells of renewal. I realized that for the first time in years, I was no longer defined by someone else's choices, someone else's presence, someone else's absence. I was defined only by myself, and that realization settled into me with the kind of peace that had once felt impossible. Rebirth does not happen all at once. It is not a single sunrise that suddenly transforms the night into day, but a gradual illumination, each ray of light revealing pieces of the self that had been hidden in the shadows. I began to see it in the way I carried myself. My posture changed, not from deliberate effort, but from the natural confidence of a woman who no longer bore invisible chains. My voice, once hesitant when speaking of my own ambitions, grew steady and sure, carrying weight not because it demanded attention, but because it no longer asked for permission. I began to live not as someone recovering from betrayal, but as someone discovering the limitless possibilities of freedom. Work became more than just a career. It became a testament to my resilience. The projects I took on flourished, and I no longer downplayed my achievements to keep someone else comfortable. Each success felt like another brick laid in the foundation of the life I was constructing for myself. Invitations came from places I once thought out of reach, and instead of hesitating, I accepted them with the certainty of someone who finally believed in her own worth. The woman who had once put her dreams aside for the sake of a man's fragile ego was gone. In her place stood someone who pursued those dreams with unapologetic determination. My personal life blossomed as well. Friendships I had neglected were rekindled, not out of desperation for distraction, but out of genuine joy in reconnecting. Dinners filled with laughter, long walks filled with conversations that stretched late into the night. These became the threads weaving a new tapestry of belonging, one that had nothing to do with being attached to a man. Family members who had watched me suffer now looked at me with admiration, telling me they had never seen me so alive, so radiant. Even strangers seemed to notice the difference. Compliments that once rolled off me now landed, not because I needed them, but because they affirmed what I already knew. I had changed. And yet, the greatest transformation was internal. For so long I had been defined by sacrifice, by how much of myself I could pour into someone else's dreams, by how tightly I could cling to the idea of us, even when it drained me. Now I was learning what it meant to pour into myself. I learned to savor mornings alone with coffee and silence, to find joy in solitary walks, where the world felt vast and open, to take pride in making decisions without consulting anyone but my own heart. I realized that solitude was not emptiness. It was space. Space to grow. Space to breathe. Space to build. I thought about him less and less, until eventually he became a shadow at the edges of memory, blurred and indistinct. When I did think of him, it was not with bitterness, but with a strange gratitude. For by abandoning me, by declaring I was not worth enough, he had unwittingly forced me into a transformation that I might never have undertaken otherwise. He had given me the sharpest kind of pain, and from that pain, I had carved out strength. He had thought he was ending me, but in truth, he had set me free. One evening, months after my refusal, I found myself standing in front of the mirror. I looked into my own eyes, into the reflection of a woman who had walked through betrayal, humiliation, and despair, and emerged not broken, but forged. My hair, cut sharp, framed a face that no longer carried the pallor of grief, but the glow of resilience. My posture was upright, my gaze unflinching, and I realized with startling clarity that I was proud of the woman staring back at me, not because of what she had endured, but because of what she had chosen to become. Rebirth is not about erasing the past, but about refusing to be imprisoned by it. The scars remained, yes, but they were no longer wounds. They were markers of survival, lines etched into me that told the story of how I had fallen and risen again. And though I knew life would carry new challenges, new betrayals perhaps, new storms to weather, I also knew that nothing could unmake the woman I had become. For I had faced the worst kind of abandonment and turned it into liberation. I had turned silence into strength, emptiness into possibility, rejection into power. In the end, he had returned desperate, hoping to reclaim what he thought was his. But what he had not understood was that I was never his possession to reclaim. I was, and always would be, my own. And now, more than ever, I lived in that truth. The woman who once waited for him at the altar no longer existed. In her place stood someone entirely new, someone untouchable, someone radiant in her independence. I had not only survived, I had been reborn.